think I answer this question differently every single time I'm asked because there are a lot of different true answers. And that's because this story has a lot of different elements. And so each element was inspired by something a little different. So I'm going to give yet another new answer to this question. One of the very early mental pictures that I had when developing this story concept was this idea of a girl whose body was physically unraveling. And I think that's because that's how I feel when I'm really stressed out or upset. I feel like I'm coming apart at the seams a little bit. And the unraveling turned into something different as the story concept progressed and developed more, but that was where the title came from, and that idea of sort of spinning and ribboning away started there with just a visual that I had in my head. At times creating this story world I thought was actually going to be the end of me because it got so complicated and so sort of like twisty and windy, and I really had to sit with it for a long time and figure out exactly how everything worked. And even when you don't explain absolutely everything on the page, I feel like it's important as the creator of this story world to understand how it all works so that it's clear in my mind and I can slip in those details so that everything does feel logical and cohesive, even when it's mysterious. And there might be a lot more about that I'm going to reveal in book 2, but it needs to all feel like it goes together. So I had to spend a lot of time in pre-writing with this one because it just got very, very complicated, very meta. I am so thrilled that Frank has already become a reader favorite because I love that character, but you never know as a writer which characters and creatures and concepts are going to resonate with readers. So it absolutely delighted me to see that Frank was a fan favorite. So Frank would love to soar over the mountains in the Pacific Northwest. From the town where I live, you can actually see Mount St. Helens, and right now it's covered in snow. It's gorgeous. So I think Frank would have a grand time flying over there. This is a tough question to answer without giving too many spoilers, so I'll try to speak in general terms. Mental health is something that is always on my radar. I don't really have a choice but for it to be on my radar because I live with PTSD. Many of the loved ones surrounding me also deal with mental health issues, so I feel like that's something I write about a lot. I have characters in this story dealing with anxiety, dealing with grief, and not so much showing trauma on the page. I'm more interested in trauma recovery, so you see more of that in my stories. Also, challenging long-held beliefs. What happens when the systems we have always trusted in and found comfort in are proven to be not as safe or good as we thought they were? How do we respond to that? How do we deal with that? So I think young readers will find those things relatable, and maybe some not so young readers will find those relatable. I write about these things because I relate to them. During the spring and summer, my absolute favorite hobby is to be out in my garden. And so I will put an audiobook on and I could spend all day out there if I had the time to do so. My other biggest hobby is my nails. That's kind of a strange hobby, I guess, but it's my one self-care thing that I have that has nothing to do with my health because I have some chronic health issues. And so there are a lot of things that I do for myself, but most of them are tied to my health. And nails are not that. They're just, it's fun and it's sparkly, and I have an embarrassingly large collection of nail polishes. One of the most important things to remember when working with an editor, especially if you're talking about your editor at your publisher, we are all on the same team and we all have the same goal, which is for your book to be as successful as possible. And it can be frustrating as an author when you feel like, your copy editor is nitpicking your commas and your word choice. And I use that example because I am a copy editor, and so I know that can be annoying for authors sometimes. But the reason I do that is because I don't want criticism to show up in your reviews later, and I don't want a contest judge to be reading your book and go, not enough attention to detail, I'm moving on to the next one. So we're all on the same team. We all want your book to be as beautiful and successful as possible. So that's really important to remember. And also that every single author, no matter how experienced, or even if you are an editor yourself, we all need editors. And even in the early stages of your writing journey, whether that looks like having a book coach or a mentor or really informed critique partners, we all need that kind of outside feedback to help us grow. In a world where art is magic, an ambitious young storyteller lands on the King's Most Wanted list when her story strands go rogue and expose dangerous truths the King is desperate to keep hidden. So it might be obvious from that summary that I like to write stories about stories, about stories about stories. There are common themes of discovering the truth and embracing who you were created to be. Fans of The Story Peddler may notice a little nod to that particular story sphere in the Rivenly sphere. So yeah, there's definitely common threads. There are also some fun mythical creatures in both series. I really don't eat while I am writing because it slows me down and I don't like that. I like to time myself and see how many words I can get in a given period of time. So eating makes a mess. It sort of slows the process down, so I don't usually do that. But I'm a huge fan of hot beverages, so I love to have coffee or tea or something of that sort while I am writing. I hate getting stuck when I'm writing, but of course that happens at some point on every single project. I think that's pretty universal for writers to get stuck sometimes. So for me, the important question to ask is, why am I stuck? Am I just exhausted? Do I need to rest and come back to it another day? Am I just too scattered? My attention is everywhere and I need to go take a walk and sort of recenter and clear my mind a little bit? Or is there a problem with the story that needs to be addressed? Do I need to really think about what I'm trying to say in this scene, or think about what, I'm trying to do overall with the story and get that really clear in my mind? Sometimes I'm stuck because I don't know where I'm going from where I'm currently at, and I have to figure that out. Otherwise, I'm going to wander into weird places. I do have pets. I have 3 cats, Waffles, Willow, and Oliver, and they are not helpful at all in my writing process. Waffles is very opinionated about what time I should go to bed, and he lets me know if he thinks I'm staying up too late. He will herd me over into my bed. Willow and Oliver like to steal my chair at my desk, so they're not helpful. They're very distracting, but I love them. I'm a little confused because on my sheet for that question, there's this extra note that says, only your pets, Lindsay? And that seems like such a strange caveat to include, because what other creatures from around my house would I possibly feature in a professional interview with my publisher aside from my cats? I would never dream of trolling our marketing director in weird and specific ways. I am so thrilled to be teaching at Realm Makers this year. It should be a really wonderful time. It always is. Writers' conferences are so important. It's an opportunity to get FaceTime with agents and editors that you're pitching to. It's an opportunity to have mentoring appointments and one-on-one time with people in the industry who are maybe a little further along than you are, and so you can sit and pick their brain for a while. It's great for networking with your peers, and obviously great for instruction in the classroom setting. So it's such an important piece of my story as to how I got started in this industry and how my career developed. I met my agent at a writer's conference, and I met my publisher at a writer's conference, and I've met most of my writer friends at conferences as well. This is a really interesting question because the faith elements in the story may not be as obvious on the surface, and yet this story, perhaps more than any other I've ever written, I felt like the Lord was right next to me the whole time. And that's because when I started the process of working on the story, this has been years in the making. So I was just wrapping up the Weaver trilogy. So it was 2020, very stressful time for everybody. And I didn't know where I was going with my career. I didn't know if I was gonna stay where I'm at in this industry, go general market. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to keep writing anymore because I was so severely burnt out and exhausted. And so what the Lord said to me was, wherever you go, whatever you do, take me with you. And so I feel like he's really been with me on this entire journey. My first thought in response to this question was that I would go into the story world of Mortal Queens and Lethal Kings, Victoria McCombs, and hang out with Thea there. But I don't actually know that I want to go hang out in the Fae world. It's a little tricksy and scary there, so maybe not. I was a voracious reader as a child and a very frequent library patron, so I would check out stacks upon stacks of books, and I read in all genres. I love mystery and contemporary. I love stuff that was a little bit scary. I love historical, and of course I love and still love fantasy. If you have seen my pre-order incentives for the Unraveling of Emlyn DuLaine, you may have guessed that Oz was a very important story world for me as a child. I tried to find as many of the 14 original books as I could because of some of the things I was dealing with at the time. I would read to escape. And so I loved to fall down the rabbit hole and go somewhere over the rainbow and be transported into somewhere that was imaginative and magical and felt really different from the life that I was living. So those story worlds really meant a lot to me then, and they still do. I have a few more of my childhood favorites that are featured in the Unraveling of Emlyn DuLaine. We have Robin Hood. You may have noticed I tend to feature forests a lot in my stories, and Sherwood definitely has something to do with that. Peter Pan. Of course, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Velveteen Rabbit. I both loved and hated the story as a child. And huge favorite of mine growing up was Anne of Green Gables. And maybe you can see why I had so much fun writing Emlyn. Getting to reference all of these classics and so many other stories was a blast. The most difficult part of writing Emlyn was just getting it done and figuring out the story world because it was really complicated and it took me a long time to fit all the pieces together. And I knew intuitively that they did go together. It took me a long time to figure out all of the ins and outs of how and why. So that was probably the most challenging part, having a big challenge with that on book 2 as well, because I feel like I created this very complicated world in book 1 and then made it even more complicated for book 2. So it's this has been a really interesting process for me, but it's been super fun. The most enjoyable part of writing Emlyn has been just letting my imagination go a little bit wild. And there are reasons why I get to do that in this story. But I think that I really wanted to tap into that kind of crazy out there type of imagination we have when we're children. That's a nod to L. Frank Baum, the author of the original Oz books. he would read letters from his readers who were children, and he would incorporate some of their ideas into his future books. And so sometimes you see creatures and things in Oz that are super off the rails, and some of those ideas came from his young readers, and I just always thought that was so cool, especially as a kid who was a fan of his work. It was also incredibly fun to write a protagonist who is herself a writer, and a writer from our world, because Tanwyn, my protagonist from The Story Peddler, was a storyteller, so she would understand what it's like to be an author. But with Emlyn, she comes from our world, and so she is a genre-aware protagonist. So when she goes into this fantastical world and is pretty sure that she's in a story, she's aware of all of the trappings of the YA genre and all of the tropes that we know and love and sometimes love to hate. And so that was really fun to write a character who was aware in the way that I'm aware and my readers are aware. Had a blast with that. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you love portal fantasy, if you're a fan of classic stories and the art of storytelling in general, and mysteries and wild literary adventures with a healthy dose of my sense of humor, I hope you will check out The Unraveling of Emlyn DuLaine.